Sadler, and this is the Washington Times Politically Unstable. Today, I'm joined with Congressman Loudermilk, who is the chairman of the House Administration Committee's Oversight Subcommittee, and he's been doing a lot of investigative work into January 6th and why there was the delay of the National Guard. And so last week, you came out with a column, as well as there was a news story on the Washington Times website that tried to explain why there was this 3-hour delay of the National Guard being deployed on the Capitol on January 6th. All of the mayhem basically occurred during those hours, but there was nobody to quell that violence. And so, doing all of the work that you've been doing, what is your explanation as to why the National Guard was delayed for these 3 hours when the President of the United States should have control of the National Guard and should be able to deploy the National Guard immediately?
Well, the short answer, a lot of politics. That's really what got in the way. Now, to make a couple of clarifications, the Speaker Pelosi has said and continues to say that President Trump could have deployed the National Guard at any time that he wanted, and that is unconstitutional. That is untrue. Because of separation of powers, the commander-in-chief of the military cannot deploy any forces to the Capitol without a formal request from the legislative branch, from the Speaker's office, more specifically, the Capitol Police Board, as it was set up at that time, that a request had to be made from the Capitol Police Board. So the idea that Trump could deploy the National Guard at any time is inherently false. There were two delays, really. There were several requests made by Chief Sund early on in the days leading up and on January 6th for the National Guard to be deployed. Again, he doesn't have the authority to make the formal request. That's from the Capitol Police Board, and he was continually rejected that. We do have with newly released information that it appears that political concerns from the Speaker's office may have contributed to those denials for the Capitol or for the National Guard to come and assist. However, what we were investigating most recently is once the formal request was made, now keep in mind, this wasn't made until there were shots fired in the Capitol. At that point, now, it's probably a good idea to get the National Guard in. It's what the Democrat leadership is thinking at this point. The formal request was made around 2:30 in the afternoon, but it was 3.5 hours from when that request was made before the National Guard was actually sent to the Capitol. And so that's been the crux of our investigation. We do know, and prior to actually getting these documents from the Department of Defense, which was an incredible feat, and I don't have enough praise for our team for their diligence and their persistence in obtaining these documents, because we're dealing with one of the largest bureaucracies in the country, dealing with the Department of Defense, and I have great admiration for our military, the greatest military in the world. But unfortunately, politics has crept into the ranks of the Pentagon as well, and so our team did a fabulous job in actually getting all 40 plus transcribed interviews of the internal investigation the Department of Defense did on the delay of deploying the National Guard. And so, but leading up to that, we did uncover early on in the investigation that President Trump had received some information on as early as January 3rd about some of the intelligence that indicated there could be violence at the Capitol. We also know that on January 3rd, he delegated authority to deploy the National Guard as needed to the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Army. So that is the proper process and procedure. The president is the commander-in-chief. He is the one who would authorize it, but he delegated that authority to appropriate channels. We also know that he had more than once mentioned you need possibly up to 10,000 troops. So he basically handed over, and even in a conversation that we have found out from General Milley's testimony, is the president on January 3rd told General Milley, use whatever forces you need, whether it's Guard, active duty, soldiers, whatever, just make sure the people are safe. Of course, the active duty could only be used in an act of true insurrection, because our military is not used against our domestically. But the National Guard exists for that purpose. In fact, the National Guard, the DC National Guard, is known as guardians of the Capitol. They are there to guard the Capitol. And so they were prepared. They were ready to go. Everything was in place from January 3rd on. All preparations were made for the National Guard to be used as needed, and that final determination would come from DoD officials in the Pentagon once a request was received. So we do know that around 2:30 there was a conference call with the Capitol Police, the Sergeant at Arms, Chief Sund, as well as the Capitol Police Board, and a formal request was made at that point. There were concerns on that conference call about the optics of uniformed members of the military being around the Capitol. There was even a recommendation by one of the senior generals that they not approve the deployment of the National Guard, which is amazing because, Chief Sund reemphasized our Capitol is being overrun. This isn't the time for politics. We're being overrun. It was from that point, it took 3.5 hours for them to get deployed.
So let's talk about this optics issue for a second. This was all being live streamed on national television. Everyone was watching it in real time. It looked chaotic. And the optics were, if the National Guard came in to quell it, the American people would think that that was a bad thing. I mean, were they viewing this as just a political protest, not an insurrection at the time? I don't understand that. When you say optics, I'm not exactly sure what was being contemplated here. If this was a true insurrection, as the Democrats have repeatedly said, a threat to our democracy, seems like they do everything in their power to make sure that the National Guard was there to protect members like yourself,
Right.
and preserve the Capitol building.
I think there were multiple levels of perception of this. Some were concerned with the optics of having a uniformed soldier with, literally, there were concerns about somebody being able to take a picture with a uniformed soldier with the Capitol in the background. Now, as a veteran, I can understand that, because you don't want to give the perception we're a third world country, that we're using the military to take over things. And so I think there was some genuine concern on that. But as you said, when you're seeing this live stream, of what's actually going on, that should, relieve those fears that, this is the time to send it down. I mean, I remember early on in 2020 in Georgia, Governor Brian Kemp called out the National Guard to assist the state troopers in some of the protests that were going on that had turned violent. That was an appropriate use. Even the general in command of the Georgia National Guard, he understands the concerns of having uniformed personnel there. But there is also, and they'll tell you this, there is also a deterrence that when you see a busload of soldiers in riot gear arrive and start moving into position, there is a deterrence there that could have squelched a lot of the violence going on. The other perception that we've started uncovering is that there was a fear, which I think is unfounded, but there was a fear that Trump was going to use the military to actually stop the count. And this is why I say that's unfounded, is because when you're at the point where people were already storming the Capitol, the request was made for the National Guard to come in and stop the violence, to stop the breach of the Capitol. That right there should tell you this is not going to be a deployment of forces to go and take over Congress. Even when the president has said 3 days before, use whatever forces you need to keep the people safe. That was his order going forward. So the perception that some have that they've said is, I'm not going to send troops to the Capitol to help in an insurrection. That's, I think, there's no credibility to that statement at all. But we even have statements from the acting Secretary of Defense who basically said, my goal that day was to ensure that the National Guard never arrived.
So let's get into the Secretary of the Army, the one on January 5th, there was an order. If the National Guard were to be deployed, it had to be directly from his orders. Is that correct? And that's relatively unprecedented. That's relatively
Right.
unusual. It had to be, and so the delay, the 3-hour delay. Where was the Secretary of the Army, and why wasn't the stamp on that approval given immediately when the request came in around 2:35?
Well, that's been the crux of a lot of our investigation to try to figure out what happened there. Now, there was a change into, let's say, the chain of command of deploying the National Guard before January 6th. It came in maybe weeks or days before January 6th. This was a result of what probably was an unauthorized use of force by the National Guard when National Guard Black Hawk flew at treetop level over some of the protesters that were in D.C. This was, the months during the time we saw the protests going on nationwide.
Yeah, George Floyd, 2020, exactly. Black Lives Matter, setting Lafayette Square on fire protests.
Yes, those things. Mm-hmm. A National Guard helicopter was used to fly at treetop level, but that was dealt with. The officer that was responsible for that was disciplined, and that was handled. But there was a decision internally that we're going to restructure the way that we deploy the National Guard, and so the Secretary of Army was added into that, from Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Army. And so we do know that the Secretary of Army was given the order from the Secretary of Defense around 3:00, and my times may be off just a little bit, but right around the 3:00 hour, Secretary Miller told Secretary McCarthy, go ahead and deploy the National Guard. Now, at that point, Secretary McCarthy did not contact the National Guard. There's some confusion, and there's testimonies that he told someone else in his office to contact National Guard. Some say he didn't say that. Some say he did. They just couldn't get in touch with him. But either way, the Secretary of the Army then went to the City Hall at D.C. for a press conference. We were told he was working on an operational plan. The issue with that is, and the operational plan is simply this: deploy the National Guard, get them to the Capitol, then they fall under the authority of the Capitol Police. They will be sworn in as law enforcement officers of the Capitol Police, and they take their orders there. So there isn't a need for an elaborate plan during an emergency. And we're talking about the National Guard's Quick Reaction Force, who is already assembled. They have the riot gear. They're ready to go. I
mean, they were just 2 miles sitting in Arlington, waiting for the call to be made. They were just 2 miles from the Capitol.
Exactly.
This press conference, this is during January 6th riots. There was a press conference that took the Secretary of the Army. He prioritized that. What was the press conference on or about? And why wouldn't his first duties be to secure the Capitol?
Well, and possibly in his mind it was, according to his testimonies, he gave someone the responsibility to call the National Guard, and they didn't. But then again, he testified he needed to work on an operational plan as well. But the way the National Guard finally got deployed, 3.5 hours later, is General Walker, the commander of the D.C. National Guard, as well as his staff, his staff came in and testified publicly to this in a hearing we had several months ago, and they have gone on the record under oath. All of them are consistent with their story. Is they're waiting. They're on a teleconference, just basically sitting there, when another general in the Pentagon walks by and says, "Why haven't you guys gone?" And so that's either there was the concern of optics, which we know was there. We don't know what the predominant reason they weren't deployed, but we do know there was concern of optics. It came from several places. We know the Secretary of Defense said his operational plan was to make sure the National Guard never went to the Capitol, period. But then again, he is the one who told the Secretary of the Army, go ahead and deploy the National Guard. Whether whether it was solely about optics or it was just a tremendous breakdown in communications and command and control, either way, there was a failure within the Department of Defense to deploy the National Guard. The issue we've had with this all along, once we started getting information, was the Department of Defense IG's report that basically laid the delay at the feet of the National Guard, which was totally untrue. And that's why we've spent so much time and effort, because my goal is to get the truth of what really happened, because you can't fix the problem unless you know where the problem exists.
But isn't that the reason why inspector generals exist at all these agencies? It's that they're nonpartisan, they're away from the agency so that they can do the interviews, do the research, and come out with these reports that figures out what went wrong, where the breakdown was, who was accountable. Why didn't the inspector general come to these conclusions? Why was the report so misleading?
That's a question that we're still trying to get answers for. Now, we have been told that, especially when it comes to the Department of Defense, that they do not make judgment on operational decisions. They only look to ensure that a policy or a law was not broken. Now, I'll take that at face value. If that's what your report is what that's supposed to show, is that the Department of Defense broke no laws, broke no policies, that's fine. But they went as far as putting the blame on the delay on the shoulders of the National Guard, which is not true. So it makes me believe, unless somebody can prove me otherwise, that there is maybe not as much independence in a lot of these IGs as we think there should be. I mean, something that we're going to have to deal with, I believe, hopefully in the next Congress, is even the Inspector General of the Capitol Police, because that Inspector General is basically hired by the Capitol Police Board. And part of his responsibility of investigation would be the Capitol Police Board itself. So how can you be fully independent if you're reporting your superiors are the people you're investigating? And so there is some issues within having an independent IG within the federal government. I think there's some things that even our Oversight Committee they're going to need to look into coming forward. Or going forward in the next Congress is the independence and autonomy of the inspector generals. We're dealing with that with the Department of Homeland Security right now, where the IG of the Department of Homeland Security has reports that part of his responsibility is to keep Congress informed about things, but the Secretary of Homeland Security is holding those reports. And so that doesn't show a lot of autonomy to me. So yes, the idea is to have an independent and autonomous inspector general. I think the reality is they don't exist everywhere.
So, looking at this, you could just say this is bureaucracy run amok, right? This is just too many. The command and control was off. People did not know their orders. And after, reports last year of Secretary Austin basically being in the hospital and not being in charge for days on end with no one knowing where he was, something like this, a mistake like this, could happen. It seems like the DOD needs to clean itself up. But contrasting that with the optics and Democrats making January 6th a centerpiece of their, 2022 campaigns, their, everything subsequent from that has been all about politics. Nancy Pelosi trying to basically paint all Republicans as a threat to democracy. How much of this was political versus nefarious versus just inept and just showing you the blow of the Washington, D.C. establishment and how it needs to kind of be slimmed down and reined in?
I think you broke it up into perfect thirds. I think there were elements of all of that came to play. I think January 6th was basically the tidal wave of all the politicization of and the swamp and the corruption and the disorganization and politics above policy in Washington, D.C. at every element. I think you summarized it perfectly there. It exposed the overwhelming weaponization of government. I think it exposed the areas of our government that have not functioned properly because of political influence. It's shown too much influence by political leaders, especially in areas of law enforcement, and the Department of Defense. And so every one of those that you laid out, there are elements of that, and probably about 1/3. And there's so many pieces of this. We're still trying to put the puzzle pieces together. It's amazing to me that the FBI can effectively go out and identify anyone who was in the crowd on January 6th, whether they came into the Capitol, whether they didn't. They've done incredible job, whether you agree with them or not. It's an impressive work of investigation to identify who these people are. But at the same time, they have no idea, no leads on the pipe bomber, and they have no idea who it was that put the gallows out, even though we have clear pictures of the people who assembled the gallows on the Capitol. They have no idea who these folks are. So it appears to me there's still some politics at play in all this. And from the very beginning, when Speaker McCarthy tasked me with this job, I told him I'd do it under one condition: that I was given the resources, the funding, and the personnel to get to the truth, and unbiased truth. Not in it to vindicate anyone, but to get to the truth. And let's let the facts tell what happened, and that we need to be fully transparent with the American people as we find out information, which is what we've been doing.
Do you have that same support from Speaker Johnson?
We do. In fact, when Speaker Johnson came in, met with him early about this. One of the things that was unique about this committee is we weren't a select committee, as let's say the January 6th committee or the committee on Chinese Communist Party or many other select committees, because they only exist in one Congress. The Speaker put this as a subcommittee of House administration because of our natural jurisdiction of Capitol Hill, but also so some of these agencies just couldn't run out the clock on us. Because we are a subcommittee of a sitting committee, this subcommittee will exist next year. And so as I sat and talked with Speaker Johnson, he was fully supportive of it. And when it comes to this subcommittee and this investigation, we've always reported directly to the Speaker's office. We've gotten our support, and I commend the Chairman Style for his support of our investigation. Our personnel, our funding, and all that does roll through the Committee on House Administration, but we report directly to the Speaker. And Speaker Johnson has, since he's been in, he's basically tripled our budget and our staff. And that was based on the incredible work that we have been doing. A lot of people weren't aware, because I'm not running to the press every time we get one little lead, because in an investigation, it makes your investigation harder if every time you get one lead, you go out there and you publicize it. We want to get to the truth. And as soon as we get to the truth, then we're going to let everybody in the nation know. We've done that periodically as we go through, just as we're doing now with the Department of Defense depositions and transcribed interviews. We're making all of those public to the American people.
And we appreciate that and that transparency. But moving forward, where do you see this investigation going? Kind of what are the next moves? And the American people, I think, want some accountability here. What can Congress do to make sure that this never happens again?
Well, on the accountability aspect, I'll touch on that first. As you know, Congress does not have any law enforcement capability other than administering our own personnel. So we're dealing with people who may still serve in Congress, but also people who have left Congress, as well as people in other agencies. We don't have a law enforcement capability, but we can make referrals to the Department of Justice. And as I have expressed many times, I have very little trust in this administration's Department of Justice. So I think any recommendations will need to come out during the next administration, during the next Congress. And as a sitting subcommittee of a full committee, we can still do that. So we'll still have work going forward. I think there needs to be some accountability, but we also need to complete the investigation to find out more about what happened. We were close to working on our final report, basically tying up some loose ends when the assassination attempt on Donald Trump happened. And that kind of raised a flag for us, is we had uncovered some issues within the Secret Service regarding the pipe bombs and how they had sent an advanced team over there and swept the entire area over at the Democrat National Committee, the DCCC, I guess Democrat Congressional Committee, their headquarters. Secret Service had deployed an advanced team over there because Vice President-elect Kamala Harris was going to be there that morning. That team walked by the pipe bomb twice, never saw it. The dogs never alerted to it. There was no effective traffic control around the DCCC. Citizens were walking by, traffic was still flowing by. So there were some major issues we had with it. Well, after the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, that raised some suspicions that maybe the issues that happened on January 6th were also some of the issues that the Secret Service faced on July the 13th. In other words, they didn't correct any of their failures during that time, and so that reopened that portion, especially the Department of Homeland Security portion. And so we had received, after a lot of fighting and work, the transcribed interviews of the Secret Service agents who were with Trump that day on January 6th. But we still hadn't gotten the IG's report. So we started doubling down our efforts there. And the information we have been able to derive is, there is a correlation between January 6th and July 13th, that there have been inherent issues, again, politicization within the Secret Service. That politics may play a role more than what we realized. But there were some issues that needed to be addressed within Secret Service that apparently had not been addressed since January 6th. So that opens up more of the investigation. But going forward for the rest of the year, I think we need to very soon address the Select Committee's report. It is fundamentally flawed. It is more of a political novel than it is an actual report of what happened and what transpired on January 6th and what led up to it. We have uncovered documentation that the Select Committee suppressed. To use the kindest word, is suppressed information that didn't support their narrative. There are people that lied to the committee. There are people that lied to investigators that we've uncovered. Basically, we need to make sure that report is never used again as historical fact, or it is used in any criminal proceeding, which both have been done in the past. And so I think we need to do some type of legislation that discredits that report, so it isn't a reflection of what happened, because it isn't. The other thing is we need to do a final report. We've done an interim report back in March of what we had uncovered at that time. I think we need to do a final report and then start laying out a legislative agenda that addresses each of the issues that we uncovered. How do we fix those? How do we make sure that the Capitol is never breached again? Regardless of who it is or why they were coming in, this Capitol should have never been breached. So we need to take the politics out of security decisions. We need to make sure that our law enforcement is properly trained, that they're the best law enforcement agents that we can get. And we recover the lost morale within a lot of the law enforcement around here. So we've got some legislative agendas that we need to work on, and the accountability piece. And so there's still a lot of work to do in the waning months of this Congress. But as I said, some of the corrective action will probably need to come next year.
Well, thank you, Congressman, so much for your work. And part of what you're doing here is going to help restore American confidence in agencies that we didn't think were politicized: the Secret Service, the FBI, agencies that, we lean on to protect our elected members of Congress, as well as our President of the United States, that have failed us terribly in the years subsequent to January 6th. Not concluding, we still have open questions about President Trump's assassination attempt and what went wrong there within DHS and the DOJ, et cetera. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
The rank and file of these agencies, the local agents in the FBI, the frontline officers of the Capitol Police, they fully support what we're doing, because the problem isn't them; it's within the leadership.
Exactly.
And structure that has been used as a political tool for far too long. But my hat's off to all of those frontline officers and agents and those who are preserving the peace and securing our liberty across the country. We're doing it for them as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.